So this is a video on my speculations on Silent Hill 3 and Buddhism. I've always been fascinated by the original Silent Hill video games created by Team Silent, especially Silent Hill, released in 1999, and Silent Hill 2, which was released in 2001. For anyone who's played the games, there's obviously many Western connections. The characters are from America. The location of the story takes place in America. Much of the literature that had existed before Silent Hill and inspired its creators is from the West, Europe and America mainly. But as I discovered that Team Silent was mainly comprised of people from Japan, I've often wondered about Eastern connections. Since my junior year of my undergraduate days in college, I've become a Buddhist studies scholar, and right now I'm in my master's program for Buddhist studies. So, with this in my background, I'd become very curious if somehow Buddhism had any kind of connections to the original Silent Hill video games. But for a long time, this was just a hunch of my imagination, with no kind of evidence whatsoever. However, I no longer need to imagine this anymore because Masahiro Ito, the artist for creating the monsters of Silent Hill, tweeted the following message. And here's a picture connected with that tweet from Masahiro Ito. And if you look closely, you can see some Japanese kanji characters written on this monster's head. According to Ito, these kanji characters roughly translate to saying something that is similar in English to saying like Lotus Sutra. But what is the Lotus Sutra? Well, the Lotus Sutra is a scripture from Mahayana Buddhism that is particularly popular in Japanese Zen, Nichiren, and Tendai Buddhism as well. Now, what is Mahayana Buddhism for those that are unfamiliar with Buddhism? That's what we're going to get into in this video. Now, when it comes to connections with Buddhism and Silent Hill, I had a Twitter conversation with Masahiro Ito, and I asked him if the Silent Hill video games were greatly inspired by Buddhism or even other religions in Japan like Shinto, to which he simply said no. So I'm not sure how much my speculations will be accurate on the Lotus Sutra phrase in Silent Hill, but I want to go over the Lotus Sutra's theology so that we can perhaps get a better understanding of what its connections might be to Silent Hill. So hence I'm going to make this video series, which will be 2 parts. So, one way to understand Mahayana Buddhism is to understand a tradition that came before it, which is known as the Theravada tradition. So we'll go over Theravada Buddhism and then transition to Mahayana to get a full picture. So the picture on the left is a representation of Theravada Buddhism. As you can see, there are many figures in the picture on the left, but there seems to be no Buddha, and that's because there is no Buddha in that picture. The reason that there is no Buddha in the picture on the left is because Theravada Buddhism believes and focuses on the idea that the Buddha only had one earthly ministry, and then afterwards, when he passed away, he's in nirvana, and he's never going to come back. So what this shows is that Theravada Buddhism focuses more on us having self-reliance when it comes to spirituality, and also ultimately obtaining nirvana in a self-reliant way. But Mahayana Buddhism came later, and Mahayana Buddhism focuses on the Buddha coming back, or other beings coming back, which are known as bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are people or other sentient beings that have obtained enlightenment, but instead of going off into nirvana solely, they decide to come back in various rebirths over and over again to help others attain enlightenment. Another major difference between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism is their scriptural authorities. From what I understand, Theravada Buddhism solely focuses on a collection of scriptures called the Pali Canon. But Mahayana Buddhism focuses not only on the Pali Canon, but also later scriptures, such as the Lotus Sutra. In East Asia, Mahayana Buddhism is the kind of Buddhism that spread predominantly. And then in Southeast Asia, that's where Theravada spread. So when it comes to Japan, since that's in East Asia, they're mainly influenced by Mahayana Buddhism. So when it comes to Team Silent, most likely they were influenced by Mahayana Buddhism. So here are some common Buddhist terms. Samsara, which is the cycle of rebirths and lives of unease and suffering. I thought I'd explain samsara a bit more. When we hear that our lives are suffering in Buddhism, a lot of times that captures people by surprise because they think, well, I'm not a slave, so my life isn't that bad. It's not like I'm literally suffering. The word for suffering in Buddhism is dukkha, which actually means more closely something like unease. So when the Buddha says that life is unease or dukkha, what he's saying is no matter what position you're in, whether you're a slave or a very wealthy, free person, you're always going to have unease. And we can definitely connect with this if we think about it. People that live in first world countries still experience a lot of unease, anxiety, and even suffering, whether it be relationships that romantically end horribly, parents getting divorced, even physically, like old age. We all eventually get old and we pass away and die. So that's what the Buddha is getting at, is no matter how good you have it, there will always be unease and anxiety in certain times in your life. The next term I have here is Anatman, which is roughly translated as no self. I thought I'd explain that more too. We're used to monotheistic religions that a lot of times say we have souls, so when we hear no self, that really strikes a lot of Westerners by surprise. And what no self doesn't mean is that we have uniqueness from one another. I may be different from my brother, say, but it's not getting at that. It doesn't mean that we're literally all the same. What it means by no self is that we have no single entity or group of entities that exist permanently and never change. Instead, every entity goes through constant change and is ultimately impermanent. And then we have nirvana, which is liberation from samsara. But you notice I have a star next to nirvana, and that's because depending on what Buddhist tradition or school you follow, nirvana can have different meanings, ultimately. We'll get to what the Lotus Sutra says about nirvana, which is very interesting. Now, when it comes to Silent Hill 3 and the Lotus Sutra, there have been some huge misconceptions about what the Lotus Sutra actually says. One video in the past on these topics said that nirvana is understood as a literal nothingness in the Lotus Sutra. However, this is not the case at all in the scripture. Now, in Theravada Buddhism, the text might sound like they're proposing oblivion or nothingness. However, even Theravada Buddhism wouldn't understand nirvana as nothingness. Another common name for Buddhism, whether it be Theravada or Mahayana, is the middle way. And what is Buddhism the middle way of, you might ask? Eternalism and annihilationism. Eternalism is the philosophy that someone stays the same because they are permanent and unchanging, a thesis that Buddhism rejects. However, Buddhism equally rejects the thesis of annihilationism, the idea that something only exists temporarily, and then once it dies, and there's no afterlife of any kind whatsoever. Now, some of you might wonder what is nirvana in Theravada Buddhism's understanding. Well, from what I've read, it seems that Theravada would understand nirvana is impossible to explain to ordinary people like us who are unenlightened. But the best explanation I can give, as someone who's looked into it, is it's something like a state of consciousness that we just can't understand, and it's outside of samsara. Theravada Buddhism does have some mind-boggling teachings, like abandoning desires, including eventually the desire for nirvana. Ultimately, the desire for nirvana is temporary in Theravada teaching, and once you obtain nirvana, you then abandon the desire for having it. A famous illustration of this Theravada teaching is the analogy of the raft. When you're in deep water, you need a raft to float on. However, once you get to the shore, you no longer need the raft, so you abandon it. In the same way, Theravada Buddhism understands desires in general and the desire for nirvana in this way, like the raft. Now, some of you might still be confused because you might have heard of the blowing out or extinguishing the flame reference in Buddhism. Isn't that a kind of oblivion reference? Well, actually, that's not a reference to extinguishing yourself because remember, there is no self in Buddhism. To extinguish yourself implies that you contain some type of unchanging entity that needs to be destroyed. But Buddhism says there's no such entity in the first place. So what does the blowing out reference mean then? Well, it actually refers to your karma. Karma can be seen as action or cause and effect. In a lot of schools of Buddhism, they say that when we do something with morally good intentions, we get more favorable outcomes. But if we do something with morally bad intentions, then we get more unfavorable results. So the blowing out reference is in connection to detaching ourselves from the involvement with karma. And this includes good karma as well. Because Theravada Buddhism says we should leave samsara as soon as possible, and not stay in it even if we're experiencing it in pleasurable ways with good karma. So when you become enlightened, then you no longer have to worry about entanglement with karma because your intentions will always be morally pure, so karma will neutralize for you and thus be extinguished. Now, Mahayana Buddhism changes a lot when it comes to the subject of desire because they have the idea of the bodhisattva. So this leads to an important question, which is, what does the Lotus Sutra say about nirvana, especially in contrast to Theravada Buddhism? What is it according to the Lotus Sutra if it's not literal nothingness, as the past YouTube videos said? So here's a quote from an article called Omni Desires, the Ending of Desire. This is by a scholar named Brooks Saporin, who is a specialist in a Chinese school of Buddhism that follows the Lotus Sutra called Tiantai Buddhism. His quote says, the sutra, which he's speaking of, the Vimalakirti Sutra, describes this sort of bodhisattva practice as neither the way of the ordinary deluded person who is a slave to his desires, nor the way of an arhat who destroys his desires. An arhat is a Theravada Buddhist term for someone who's obtained nirvana the Theravada way, which is to get rid of all desires, even desire for nirvana. Anyway, the quote continues, a further elaboration of the raft of mindfulness that is the middle way between desire and non-desire. He is aware of his desires and makes use of his desires as part of his bodhisattva path. The sutra sharply disparages the arhat who has destroyed his passions, comparing him to a burnt seed or a lotus flower planted in the air. It produces nothing. It cannot grow. It cannot lead to Buddhahood, nor to the expansive interaction with otherness that is the bodhisattva path. So, what this article quote is getting at is the differences in the goal, the ultimate salvific goals of Theravada Mahayana Buddhism. As I've said earlier, Theravada Buddhism focuses more on just self-reliance and liberating yourself from samsara. So this means that eventually we get rid of all desires, even the desire for nirvana, because once we've obtained it, we no longer need that desire, so we abandon it like the shore and the raft. So, or like the raft on the shore. So when it says that it's like this idea of someone doing the Theravada way of nirvana is like a burnt seed or a lotus flower planted in the air. It's getting at the idea that you can't really produce anything for others. So the burnt seed, of course, is obvious. Seeds won't work if they're burned. And a lotus flower comes from mud. It can't, obviously, no seed can work in the air. So what this is getting at is that we can use these messy things like desire to enhance others on the path to Buddhahood. A way you can think of it is there can't be anything such as nirvana if there's no such thing as suffering or samsara. In order to have a concept of one, you have to have a concept of the other. So that's what this quote is getting at. And this shows a sharp distinction between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. But still, what about the Lotus Sutra? What does the Lotus Sutra have to say about nirvana? So here I have another quote from the same article, and I add some context to what the quote is saying. So according to Chinese Tiantai or Japanese Tendai Buddhism, the Lotus Sutra teaches there is no end to bodhisattvahood nor any beginning. Buddhahood is nothing but eternal bodhisattvahood that recognizes that there is never any end to its process of rebirth. So from what I understand, a lot of Mahayana schools have the option where you can go into nirvana without remainder in samsara, or you can be a bodhisattva, being reborn in samsara over and over again willfully to help others. But according to these schools that follow the Lotus Sutra, they interpret it to mean that no matter what you do, you're always being a bodhisattva, and that there is no nirvana without remainder in samsara option. Now, this is very striking, and it makes us want to explore the Lotus Sutra further. So now we must see what the Lotus Sutra says. So here's an email of a conversation I had with a professor who's a specialist on Chinese Tiantai Buddhism, again, a school of Buddhism that has the Lotus Sutra as its main scripture. And as you can see, the professor's email says, "The Lotus Sutra announces in the second chapter that nirvana, as the literal extinction of samsara, was only a upaya. There is no end to samsara." Now, the word upaya is probably jumping out to a lot of you. And upaya is a Mahayana Buddhist term which is commonly translated in English as skillful means. Skillful means is basically the idea that you do something that's typically unconventional, like lying, but you do it not so much with bad intention, but good intention actually for a good result. A classic example of perhaps a bodhisattva or Buddha lying could be a classic situation that we've probably heard before. Lying to Nazis so that you can save Jews that are hiding in your home. Normally we would consider it wrong to lie to authority, especially to the government, but in the case of having Jews in your house, we would consider it good to lie to the Nazi government so that you might save the Jews. If you tell the Nazis the truth, then it seems that that would most likely and definitely lead to the Jewish people's doom. So it might be better to lie. Now, I must say in Mahayana Buddhist understanding that the idea of using skillful means can only be performed by Buddhas or those who are enlightened, like bodhisattvas. It can't be used by unenlightened people like us. The reason Buddhas can use this, or bodhisattvas can use this, is because they are considered omniscient beings, so they know all the outcomes of what would happen from their actions, whereas unenlightened people like us don't have all-knowingness or omniscience, so we wouldn't know what would happen. And here's a quote from the Lotus Sutra about the idea that the professor was getting at. So I added in a little context because people would misunderstand the truth about nirvana. That is why, O Shariputra is one of the Buddha's disciples, I devised a method of teaching the way to extinguish all suffering through nirvana. even though I taught nirvana, it is not the true extinction. So it seems to me that based on this quote from the Lotus Sutra, which is found in chapter 2, I think Tiantai, or Japanese Tendai Buddhism, is right to think of nirvana as eternal bodhisattvahood. Now, this leads to some interesting questions. And I also want to give a little further background about why the Buddha taught nirvana in the original Theravada way. Now, according to the Lotus Sutra, he taught it in the original Theravada way because he thought people would misunderstand him if he taught in this revelation, huge revelation way in the Lotus Sutra. And he was afraid that they would think if nirvana is not the extinction of samsara, then that means they can more or less not care about morality and use their desires in any way they wish or want to. So the Buddha taught that nirvana was the extinction of samsara originally, so that people would produce good merits and try to rid themselves of bad desires. However, the Buddha says in the Lotus Sutra that nirvana is not the extinction of samsara and all of our desires, but rather the purification of our desires. I think this goes back to the middle way concept I spoke of earlier. I think the Lotus Sutra understands the middle way of Buddhism being between an extinction of samsara and a complete embrace of samsara as it is naturally. Now, this will get into further information, but keep that middle way concept in mind. Not embracing samsara as it is naturally, but also not extinguishing it. So, I wanted to give some more background on Theravada Buddhism because some of you might be confused about this idea of skillful means with the Buddha and Mahayana Buddhism and the Lotus Sutra. Some of you might think that it seems quite silly to believe the Lotus Sutra, and that Theravada Buddhism seems more believable since it doesn't have such a focus on skillful means. However, when looking at the Theravada texts, it appears that the Buddha did hint at some skillful means type methods. To illustrate this, I'm going to explain what the Buddha supposedly did according to the Pali Canon, the Theravada Buddhist scripture. In a certain section of the Pali Canon, the Buddha is asked by a Brahmin how to make union with the god Brahma. The Buddha tells him that he needs to thoroughly practice loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Brahmanism is an Indian religion that believes in an immortal soul and other doctrines that Buddhism rejects. Here's an actual quote from the article to give more solid context and information. This passage does not portray the historical Buddha as a liar. What he tells Vasetta, the Brahmin, is strictly and literally true, but Vasetta is being seriously misled. He thinks he is hearing instructions about the final religious goal, about freedom from cyclic existence. As he puts it at the beginning of the sutta, the Pali word for the Sanskrit word sutra, just so we're all clear, the path of salvation that leads one who follows it to union with Brahma, where Brahma is undoubtedly to be understood as the supreme deity of the universe, in either a monotheistic or a monist sense. But on the Buddha's own view, that's not what Vasetta is getting. The Buddha sees himself as giving Vasetta instructions on how to be reborn as a god in a long-lasting but impermanent heaven, a heaven that is squarely inside cyclic existence, or samsara, and in no sense represents a liberation from it. The Buddha could have told Vasetta this, but he didn't. Perhaps he had good reasons to believe that given the details of the young Brahmin's current psychological state, by practicing with the goal of union with Brahma, Vasetta would make more progress than he would if he had been given a more accurate understanding of the nature of liberation in Buddhism. So what this is saying is the Buddha didn't literally technically tell a lie or anything that went against Buddhism, but in the context of how he told Vasetta the Brahmin, it sounded and seemed as if he was speaking within Brahmanism, again, a religion that in a lot of ways is totally opposite of Buddhism. The only thing I can think of where Brahmanism is similar to Buddhism is their idea of getting outside of samsara or cyclic existence of rebirths. But in a lot of ways, Brahmanism is very different from Buddhism. like its belief in the permanent soul, and so on. So we can see from this that the Buddha did use some skillful means like methods. As the article suggests, he did this because he thought that the Brahmin Vasetta would be reborn as a god in the god realm, but the god realm in Buddhism is still considered impermanent and part of samsara. So now let's continue on the Lotus Sutra and let's focus on it and see what nirvana is if it's not extinction of samsara, as was thought in Theravada Buddhism. So, if nirvana is not a place of detachment from samsara, then what is it and why call it nirvana? This is a good question and an obvious one after hearing what we've gone through. I think we can understand nirvana in the Lotus Sutra's understanding like this. In Theravada Buddhism, nirvana was understood more or less as a physical-like state. However, in the Lotus Sutra, nirvana is a state of mind, the mind of constantly helping those who are suffering, the mind of the bodhisattva. In other words, nirvana in the Lotus Sutra is not detaching ourselves from all desires and therefore detaching ourselves from everyone and everything in the world, but rather a rational understanding and embrace of the world, seeing the world as a bodhisattva rather than as a selfish individual. Another way of understanding nirvana in the Lotus Sutra sense is this. A lotus flower cannot grow unless it grows through the filthy mud. Although the growth of the lotus is through dirty substances, the blooming of the lotus flower itself is clean and beautiful. In the same way, nirvana cannot be reached except through the filthy world of samsara. None of us can ever have a nirvana experience unless there's a samsara experience first. So, what does this have to do with Silent Hill? Well, I have some ideas and I articulate them more in the part 2 of this video series. I encourage you to check that out. In that video, I'll get more into the Silent Hill series. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you like part 2 as well.